Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be demoing how to paint a pumpkin using watercolors. Here is a close-up of my palette. I have quinacridone red, cadmium red, gamboge, cadmium yellow light, sap green, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, violet, burnt sienna, and Payne's gray on my palette. And then here is the reference photo I'm working off of for this picture. I do change the stem just a little bit, but you can pause this and take a screenshot of it to use as a drawing guide. And then here is a sketch I did of the picture so that you can have an easier time breaking down how to draw it. So once I taped my paper to a board, I'm just using foam core board, I started sketching out my pumpkin. And this is a smaller picture. This is only 6 by 8 inches, I believe. And so it's not a very large picture. There's not tons of room to work around on it. So I did have to kind of tweak my proportions a little bit for this piece. And I had a little bit of a struggle drawing the stem and just trying to figure out how I wanted to curve it and foreshorten the stem piece. So I kind of go back and forth on how I'm going to draw it. The trick is I am not pushing very hard. I'm not permanently indenting my paper so that I'm not creating damage. Because if you create really deep indents on your paper, what will happen is the paint will pool in those line markings. I am drawing it a little bit darker than I normally would so that it shows up on the camera. Sometimes light graphite lines kind of get washed out in the studio lighting, so I did draw it a little bit darker for you. Now, once I have it all sketched in, I'm going to be working on the background. And to do this background, I want it to be really soft and blurry. I don't want tons and tons of lines or details, and I need it to kind of fall back visually so that the pumpkin in our foreground can be the main focus. So to do that, I'm doing a wet into wet wash. That is where I get the paper wet first, and then I apply really wet paint to it, and that allows the paint to really flow and move on the paper. So I'm just taking kind of a rusty red-orange color for it. I didn't realize until later on into the video that half of my palette was out of frame, so I apologize that you can't see the exact colors I'm mixing, but I just wanted kind of a rusty brown orange color, and I start off with kind of a pale yellow. So right now I have some burnt sienna on there, and now I'm going to create kind of a darker green because one of those pumpkins, it hasn't turned orange yet in the background, and I'm also going to use the green color for the shadow. So I mixed some ultramarine blue and sap green to create this like dark green color, and I'm just laying it down with some of the other colors we've added to the paper. This green will mix with it, and it will continue to kind of dull down and neutralize. Wet into wet washes are a little bit easier when you have a really wet paintbrush, a paintbrush that can hold a lot of moisture. So natural hair brushes work great for this, or if you see like faux natural hair brushes, what they're meaning is that they're paintbrushes that hold a lot of water. And what that does is it makes it so you can lay down more layers of paint. You can work longer without having to dip your paintbrush back into your palette. And that allows you to work more quickly before your paper dries. 100% cotton paper or nicer quality watercolor paper also helps with this because it can hold on to that moisture a little bit longer, and it gives you a little bit more working time before your paper dries. And I'm just building up some more layers. I created kind of a brownie color using violets and our greens and burnt siennas. And I just wanted it kind of like a brown, gray, black color. And it's going to help this really fall back visually in value. One thing to keep in mind, or another thing, there's lots of things I say to keep in mind, but another thing to remember with watercolor is that it dries lighter than what it appears when wet. So it will be a little bit lighter in value once it dries. So if you want something to be really, really dark, I would make your color a couple of values darker than what you want it to be when it dries. That way you're not having to spend quite as much time tweaking or adjusting your painting. Now I'm using some dark red tones to help build up the shadow areas on these background pumpkins, again, working while the paper is really wet. I have found that these paintbrushes that I'm working with do hold a lot of water. I bought them a couple months ago to use as paintbrushes in my watercolor classes because I didn't want to take expensive paintbrushes with me back and forth just in case they got ruined. So I bought these off of Amazon, and they are goat hair paintbrushes, and they work really, really well. This is my first time using a goat hair paintbrush, and they hold a ton of moisture. The set was really affordable. It was like 10 paintbrushes, I think, in the set, and it was like $15 full price. And sometimes they go on sale for like $12 or $13. And they held a nice point. They didn't lose a lot of hair. And they've been really, really nice for teaching because I can work quickly because they hold so much moisture, but they aren't so expensive that I'm worried about them. Like if I lost these paintbrushes, I'd be bummed, but it wasn't like losing a $50 paintbrush. So if you're looking at kind of upgrading your paintbrushes without breaking the bank and you're not worried about them being vegan, then this might be a good option for you. This paint tool I'm using is called a heat gun, and or an embossing gun. It's used a lot in crafts, and I bought it in the embossing craft section of my, I think it was Hobby Lobby years ago, and I love it for drying my paper quickly because I wanted to dry this paper background quickly before I added more layers of paint because it was drying up enough that if I put paint on, it would pick up the layers underneath it. And so having the paper be completely dry allowed me to start adding a few more layers and darken up some values. So if you find that you don't like waiting for your paper to dry too often, or it's a frustrating part of watercolor for you, think about getting a heat gun and use that. If you don't want to buy a heat gun, you can try a blow dryer. You just need to make sure you don't have it blowing or like creating too much wind because it can push your paints around. But once the background was dry, then I came in with some pale yellow and did a layer of it all over the pumpkin. And then while it was still wet, I came in with a stronger concentration of the gamboge, so the yellowy orange color, and started blocking in where some of the lines and indents on the pumpkin are going to be. And I'm just starting to build up the values with this. Remember, watercolor, you typically work from light to dark. So you do really light values first, and then you just gradually darken it up as you go along because you don't have white paint to go over the top. Whereas with acrylic paints, often, or oil paints, sometimes you work from dark to light and you do all your darker values first and then you do your highlights over the top. So the transition from watercolor to acrylic paints and back and forth can be tricky because the way you approach your colors and your layering is reversed from each other. Now I'm just taking some darker orange colors and again adding it to where some of these stronger shadows are going to be on the pumpkin. This was my first time doing this picture. I was just trying to brainstorm ideas for my watercolor class. And so I saw this picture and I decided to test it out. So this whole video is a little bit of a hot mess in that I didn't have like a full plan on how to approach it. Lots of times for videos or classes, I'll do like a practice piece to kind of figure out what I'm going to do. And then I'll do the recorded video so that it's a little bit more refined and the steps are a little bit more clear. And then I'll go on to teach it in person so that I have a really good foundation of what we're going to do. And I thought I was going to record another version of this, and I never did. And then my class ended up not painting it because we took too long with our poppy painting that I did a few weeks ago, which is all right because we got to spend time on it and really learn how to do the different details. But I thought if I was going to be sharing how to paint a pumpkin, this was probably my last week to do it this year, since we are moving into winter and Christmas holidays and New Year's and all that kind of stuff. So it's the end of fall, so this will be my last pumpkin picture. And I am starting to add some more green tones to the pumpkin. So I mixed some sap green and some of our oranges. And that is to really help create the shadow area without it becoming too vibrant. I don't want this to become like bright red or neon. So I added the green tones, and then I did a burnt sienna and violet mixture to really push some of those values in and make them darker. And then as I work my way around to the other side of the pumpkin, I'm going to start using less of the darker, duller colors and bring in a little bit more vibrancy, a little bit more of the bright oranges, and those kinds of tones to that side that's a little bit more in highlight. Now this paper doesn't hold a lot of moisture, especially since it's on the foam core board. So what I'm doing is if I'm blocking in the color, and then I am blending it out with a damp paintbrush that doesn't have very much paint on it. And that just helps to soften those edges and lines since the paper is drying and a wet into wet wash isn't going to work anymore on it. I'm using the bright cadmium yellow on the highlighted section of the pumpkin, also to help blend in those colors and to help add some of that lightness and vibrancy. And I'm sorry if you hear like a lot of background noises, kind of like with the recording of this video. The editing and the voiceover has been a bit of a struggle. We're going into a holiday. My husband's off of work and he is working on construction projects. So there's a lot of sawing going on outside, and neighbor kids are home from school. My kids get home from school tomorrow or they're home from school this afternoon, and then they'll be home the rest of the week. So I'm running out of quiet times in my house to be able to do a voiceover. So I'm currently doing this in my bathroom so that I have less noise. But again, I just did some more layers. I dried it completely so I could add layers on top. So I'm starting to work on the stem, and I wanted to make sure the main body of the pumpkin was dry so that the stem colors wouldn't leak into the main body. I did a base yellow, a base layer of yellow, and now I'm adding in some of that sap green that we had on the palette, and I'm just doing some like line work with this. The stem is very textured. It's because it comes from a vine, and so it's kind of windy, and there's ribs and divots in it, and so by filling in the color while creating this line is really going to help portray the texture of the stem. And I'm just making sure my lines kind of match the curves of the stem and they bend around with it. And I'm just adding those layers one at a time to really create some of that depth. So now I've mixed a darker green, sap green, gamboge, ultramarine blue, really created this darker foresty green, and now I'm coming in and doing those darker lines and details, and then I'll blend those out in a little bit. I'm using a smaller paintbrush for this just to help with some of the control and line work so it doesn't become too big and bulky. Feel free to change out your paintbrush. If you feel like it's too big and out of control, feel free to move to a smaller paintbrush. Use the largest one you feel comfortable with. So if your paintbrush is too big, downsize it. I'm blending out some of those lines that I did with a little bit of water. And so we've started to block in some of the dimension and shape of the stem. And now I'm drying it off using the heat tool. And you see me like touch my paper. That's so I can tell how wet the paper is, because if it's still cool to the touch and it's not room temperature anymore, it hasn't dried. Even if it doesn't feel wet, but if it feels cool, it still hasn't dried enough. Once I felt that it was dry, I started coming in with some more layers. I'm using the gamboge color, and doing a layer all the way over the top of the whole pumpkin with that. And that's going to help smooth out some of what we did before. So now that I have a whole layer of this gamboge yellow color, I am going to mix some of our cad red and our quinacridone red with the gamboge, so the orangey yellow color, and I'm going to start building up some more layers of shadow. So I'm focusing it on the areas that I want it to be a little bit darker and making sure I'm preserving those highlights as much as I can. I would say one of my biggest complaints about this picture that I did and what I would do differently is make sure I'm preserving some more of those highlights, because I lost a lot of them, and then I ended up coming in with a gel pen at the end to bring back some of those. And there's nothing wrong with using some kind of ink or something like that to bring back your highlights, but it's always nice when you don't have to. So this red tone, and notice how it was mixed next to some greens, so it helped dull and neutralize it a little bit. And I'm putting that in those shadowed sections again, just building up these layers and looking at my reference photos, following the curves that I see. And then if there's anything that's getting too dark, I take a clean wet paintbrush, scrub it out a bit, and then dab it up with a clean rag. And again, just looking at that reference photo and kind of cleaning up some lines and some detail work, and like just tweaking and adjusting my picture as needed. Now I'm coming in and working on the background. You can see it's gotten very light. It's now lighter than the pumpkin in the foreground, and it's a little bit rough. So I'm doing a layer of kind of a reddish brown. It was some of our reds mixed with the burnt sienna violet mixture. Did a base layer of that. Now I'm taking some of our burnt sienna, like ultramarine blue and red mix, and adding that to the mix to help darken it and smooth out some of these line details. I want some texture to show through because I want it to look like it's textured like a pumpkin, but I don't want it to have so much line and detail and harsh lines that it competes with the pumpkin in the foreground. I did a blue and gamboge mixture to make a dull green, and I added a little bit of violet to it. And I'm using that to help create some of the shadows on this pumpkin. And the reason why I'm using blue in the background is, one, blue tends to recede a little bit more visually, and especially if it's grayed out. But this one isn't grayed out, but using blue because it helps recede visually. It feels more like it's in shadow. And then two, blue is the opposite of orange. And so by having some blue in the background, it's going to help the orange of our foreground pumpkin really pop and stand out. So I'm kind of playing with that. I'm also darkening up the values so the highlights on this foreground pumpkin really stand out as well. If your highlights aren't standing out and your whites, you can't get your whites light enough, then that means all the colors around it need to darken up. And if your black isn't black enough and it's not like you're using straight black out of the tube and it's still not dark enough, then that means the colors around that need to lighten up a little bit. That way you can get the balance of values so that you can get that dimension. Now I'm doing some more work on the stem, creating some of the like bubbly, bumpy texture right at the base of it. And then following the curves of the twist in the bend in the stem to help really start to define it. In the reference photo, half of the stem is blurred out like the background and half of it is detailed. I decided to keep the whole thing in detailed and kind of have it draw your eye into this foreground pumpkin, and it kind of goes around in a loop, drawing your eye into the pumpkin and then up to the stem and kind of around in that way. Now, I know I say this in every video, but it is one of the key things that helped my art really get pushed to the next level, and that is to take a break. If you are getting sick of staring at your picture and you don't know what to change or adjust, take a break. Go eat your lunch or your breakfast, go take a walk or do a chore, do something, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And that will really, really help you know what to do next and tweak and adjust it. And I don't always take that advice. I didn't take that advice on this picture. I kind of was trying to paint it before all my kids came home from school as I was prepping for my watercolor classes. So I painted it really quick. And there's things that if I would have paused and come back to it with fresh eyes, I could have done a lot nicer and neater of a job, and I wouldn't have been as frustrated at times with this piece. Now I will say, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, yellow is my favorite color, so it is a little bit harder for me, and that's where taking a break would have been really beneficial, because I could have kind of thought through the process of how I was going to approach it a little bit better if I had gone a little bit slower and taken regular breaks. Another thing to think about, and this is something you want to think about before you start a picture, is what style do you want it to look like? Do you want it to look like an illustration? Do you want like pen and ink lines on it, or your pencil to show through and just have it be a wash of color? And you're all right with it even looking two-dimensional and being cartoony? Do you want it to look dimensional and round but still have like that feeling of it being painted? Do you want it to look mostly realistic but have just touches of it where people can tell, oh, this is a painting, this isn't a photo? Or are you going for full photorealism where you could trick someone into thinking that that was an actual photograph instead of a painting? Because how realistic or what style of painting you want it to be affects what colors you use, it affects how you draw it, and how you approach painting it. So just something to keep in mind is taking your time to think about how you want it to look in the end and what is your goal with this picture. Now, I do highly recommend that people switch up their routines and kind of change painting in different styles, because it can really make you aware of maybe crutches that you have in painting and things that you rely on and things you don't always push yourself out of your comfort zone with. And as I've been talking, I've just been building up more layers on this picture, trying to really refine the shapes of those highlights and the shapes of the shadows and kind of the variation within them. And as I'm building it up, I'm getting a little bit more smoother of an effect on the pumpkin, so it's not so like textured from paintbrush lines. I'm not trying to get rid of those altogether, because that is definitely part of what I wanted this picture to look like, but I don't want it to be too rough. I want some smoothness to it. And I'm just using some kind of red tones to build up some more of these lines, and I'm making sure I'm keeping kind of the highlights where they appear in the reference photo. Hopefully having the reference photo in the corner, even though it's tiny, can help you guys get a feel for where some of the shadows are and why I'm making things look the way that they are in comparison. Because at least for me, sometimes if the reference photo is only shown at the beginning, I kind of forget what it's supposed to look like towards the end. So I want to make sure you guys have it available. Now I'm just darkening up the values. I was kind of squinting at my picture and kind of looking, like leaning back to look at it so that I could see what things need to be darkened up, what things need to be lightened, colors that need to be tweaked. Sometimes kind of getting a little bit of a distance between you and the picture and kind of squinting at it can help you kind of see the big general picture of it without being distracted by the details. So I'm just darkening up some more of the stem using that kind of dark blue, violet, green color that we'd mixed earlier, and just really deepening these values. I want the left side of the stem to be a little bit more in shadow because the light is coming from the right, but with the twist and bends in the stem, it does make the highlights appear just a little bit different than what they would normally be if it was like straight up and down. And one thing to remember is at this point in the picture, what I'm doing might not be what your picture needs. Maybe your picture got really, really dark in the background at the beginning, so you don't need to darken it up. You need to look at your own picture and see what it needs. I can only show you what my individual picture needs. That's one of the hard things about doing videos like this is I can't offer individual critique for your personal picture and what it needs. But I hope I'm giving you guys the tools so that you can evaluate your own pictures and see how you need to tweak and adjust it. So for me, I felt like the background was too light and I needed to deepen it up and darken those values within it and kind of smooth it out so that it wasn't quite so textured. Adding some more blues to really help that orange pop some more, just like I mentioned earlier, and just really cleaning up some of those lines around the edges of this pumpkin that's in the foreground. You might look at your reference picture and decide that you need to bring back some more highlights. And so you take a clean wet paintbrush, you scrub those areas that are in highlight, and then you dab them up with a clean rag to bring back some of that light to them. Now I'm about done with this picture. And probably the last 5 minutes of this did not get recorded. I didn't realize my battery had died. And so this is about where I ended it. And what I ended up doing is once this dried, I came in and did a few little highlights with a gel pen. This is something I wouldn't have done if I didn't absolutely need to, but I felt like the highlights gave it a little bit more dimension. I couldn't scrub back the highlights anymore because I had used some staining colors like the quinacridone red to create some of the oranges, and so I couldn't lift it up any brighter. So I did a few little lines with the gel pens, and that kind of brought it back to life. Now it did make it look a little bit more illustrative instead of like photorealistic, but that's okay with me. I was just having fun with the picture. So hopefully this isn't too much of a mess of a tutorial for you, and it did give you some help on how to approach this picture. If you found this video helpful or instructive in any way, please hit the like button. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comment area down below. And if you want to see more of what I create and what I do here on this channel, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. I will see you next time. Bye.